Normandy, July 1944. If you'd walked through an American Armored Division's maintenance area behind the front lines, you would have witnessed something that wasn't in any Army technical manual. Sherman tank crews were frantically welding anything they could find to the front of their tanks. Pieces of destroyed German armor, sections of railroad track, spare track links from their own tanks, sandbags piled on the engine deck, concrete poured into wooden frames bolted to the hull, logs chained to the front glacis plate. These modifications weren't authorized by the War Department. They weren't approved by engineers or tested by ordnance specialists. They were desperate improvisations by men who'd watched too many of their friends burn to death inside Shermans that German anti-tank guns had punched through like tin cans. The tankers had a name for their vehicles that spoke volumes about their confidence in American armor: Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company, whose slogan was "Lights first time, every time." When your tank has a nickname that references how quickly it catches fire, you tend to get creative about additional armor. This is the story of the field modifications that Sherman crews made to keep themselves alive, the psychological desperation that drove them, the surprising truth about whether any of it actually worked, and the invention that came not from Army engineers, but from a sergeant with a welding torch who solved a problem that was killing tankers by the hundreds. To understand why Sherman crews were welding scrap metal to their tanks, we need to understand what they were facing in the summer of 1944. The Sherman tank had been designed in 1940-1941, when the primary armored threat was expected to be German Mark III and Mark IV tanks with 50mm and 75mm guns. Against those threats, the Sherman's armor was adequate. The front glacis plate was 51mm thick and angled at 56 degrees, giving it effective thickness of about 90mm against incoming rounds. The turret front was 76mm thick. The side armor was 38mm. By 1941 standards, this was reasonable protection for a medium tank weighing 30 tons. But by June 1944, the tactical situation had changed dramatically. The Germans had deployed Tigers with 80mm guns and Panthers with 75mm high-velocity guns that could penetrate a Sherman's front armor from over a mile away. More importantly, the Germans had developed extremely effective anti-tank guns and positioned them defensively in the Bocage countryside of Normandy. The German 75mm Parquet 40 anti-tank gun could penetrate the Sherman's front armor from 1,000 yards. The 80mm could kill a Sherman from almost any angle at any range the gunner could see clearly. And the Germans had these weapons positioned in defensive positions, behind hedgerows, in sunken roads, and in camouflaged emplacements where they could fire first. The tactical mathematics were brutal. A Sherman advancing across open ground or down a Norman lane had perhaps a 50-50 chance of seeing the anti-tank gun before it fired. If the German gun fired first, which it usually did because it was positioned defensively and the crew had prepared their firing positions, the Sherman was dead. The round would penetrate the front armor, and what happened next depended on what the round hit inside the tank. Best case scenario, it would kill or wound crew members, but not ignite the ammunition or fuel. Worst case, which was disturbingly common, the penetrating round would hit stored ammunition and the tank would brew up, tanker slang for catching fire and burning. Sherman crews had about 10 to 15 seconds to bail out of a burning tank before the ammunition cooked off in a catastrophic explosion. Many crews didn't make it out. The statistics from Normandy were terrifying for tankers. In some engagements, American armored units lost 50 to 70% of their tanks in a single day. Replacement tanks and replacement crews were fed into the meat grinder as fast as they could be brought forward. Tank commanders knew that their life expectancy, once they engaged German armor or anti-tank guns, was measured in minutes or hours, not days or weeks. This wasn't the mobile, fluid tank warfare that doctrine had promised. This was attritional horror, where American numerical superiority ground down German defensive positions through sheer mass, and Sherman crews paid the price in blood and fire. Under these circumstances, tankers started looking for anything that might give them an edge, any modification that might stop a German round, any adaptation that might buy them a few extra seconds to spot the anti-tank gun before it fired. The official channels were useless. If you reported that the Sherman's armor was inadequate, you were told that the tank had been thoroughly tested and met all requirements. If you requested additional armor, you were told that adding weight would reduce mobility and reliability. If you pointed out that Panthers and Tigers outgunned and out-armored Shermans, you were reminded that American tanks were designed to be reliable, easy to maintain, and mass-producible, not to win one-on-one duels with German heavy armor. So the tank crews took matters into their own hands. The most common field modification was welding spare track links to the front of the tank. Sherman tracks were made of heavy steel, and each link weighed around 30 pounds. If you welded a couple dozen track links to your front glacis plate, you'd created an additional layer of steel between you and incoming rounds. The theory was simple. The German round would have to penetrate the track links first, which might slow it down or deflect it enough that the main armor could stop it. Tankers scavenged spare track sections from destroyed vehicles, from supply dumps, anywhere they could find them. Maintenance crews got very good at welding track to armor plate, even though this wasn't something they'd been trained to do. The visual effect was striking. Shermans rolling through Norman villages looked like they were wearing chainmail, festooned with dangling track links covering the front and sometimes the sides of the hull. The crews took pride in their modifications, discussing techniques and comparing whose tank had the most additional armor. It was psychologically important. They were doing something to protect themselves rather than passively accepting their fate. Whether it actually worked was a different question. Other crews went even further. Some tanks had pieces of armor plate from destroyed German vehicles welded to their hulls. If you knocked out a Panther and had access to a cutting torch, you could cut sections of that Panther's armor plate and weld them to your Sherman. It was poetic justice, using German armor to protect American crews from German guns. Other crews welded structural steel, I-beams and channel iron to their tanks. Some units poured concrete into wooden frames and bolted them to the hull. The concrete would absorb some of the impact energy and hopefully slow penetrators. Sandbags were extremely popular. Crews would pile them on the engine deck, on the front slope, anywhere they could secure them. The sand would theoretically provide spaced armor, forcing rounds to penetrate multiple layers. Then there were the truly desperate or creative modifications. Some crews chained logs to the front of their tanks, creating a wooden barrier that might deflect or slow rounds. Others welded scrap metal in elaborate patterns, creating what looked like medieval armor, complete with overlapping plates. A few tanks ended up with so much additional material welded to them that they looked like rolling junk piles, barely recognizable as Shermans under all the modifications. The problem was that most of these modifications didn't actually work the way the crews hoped. The Army Ordnance Department, alarmed by reports of unauthorized modifications, conducted tests on various field expedient armor schemes. The results were discouraging. Welded track links provided minimal additional protection. They might deflect or slow a round by a small amount, but against the high-velocity anti-tank guns the Germans were using, the additional protection was marginal at best. The track links added significant weight to the tank, which reduced mobility and increased wear on the suspension and drivetrain. In some cases, the added weight actually made tanks more vulnerable because they couldn't maneuver as quickly to avoid fire. Concrete armor was even worse. Concrete is strong under compression, but weak under the high-energy impact of armor-piercing rounds. The shells would punch through the concrete, often shattering it into fragments that created secondary projectiles inside the tank. The concrete added tremendous weight, sometimes over a ton, which severely impacted the tank's performance. Sandbags were largely useless. Artillery fragments might get stopped by sandbags, but anti-tank rounds went through sand like it wasn't there. Worse, wet sandbags added enormous weight and could shift during movement, throwing off the tank's balance. The most problematic aspect of all these modifications was that they gave crews false confidence. Tankers who'd spent hours welding track links to their hull believed they'd made their tank significantly more survivable. When they then took unnecessary risks based on that belief and were killed anyway, it was a double tragedy. The Army faced a psychological dilemma. Should they tell crews that their modifications were largely ineffective, which would crush morale and leave tankers feeling completely helpless, or should they tacitly allow the modifications to continue because they helped crews psychologically, even if they didn't help much physically? Different commanders made different decisions. Some banned unauthorized modifications, ordered crews to remove the extra weight, and insisted that proper tactics and crew training were better protection than welded scrap metal. Other commanders looked the other way and let crews modify their tanks however they wanted, figuring that morale and initiative were worth preserving, even if the modifications themselves were questionable. A few progressive commanders actually organized modification programs, bringing in welders and materials to help crews add armor in the most effective possible way, even if that effectiveness was limited. But while tank crews were wrestling with the armor problem, they were facing an even more immediate tactical nightmare, the Norman Bocage. The Bocage was a type of countryside unique to Normandy, characterized by small fields enclosed by thick hedgerows. These weren't decorative garden hedges. They were ancient earthen berms, 6 to 8 feet high, topped with dense vegetation and trees, their roots penetrating deep into the soil. Centuries of growth had turned these hedgerows into nearly impenetrable barriers. Norman farmers used them as field boundaries, and the dense vegetation prevented erosion and provided windbreaks. For American armor, the Bocage was hell. The fields were small, often less than 100 yards across, separated by hedgerows that channeled tank movement into predictable routes. Tanks couldn't see over the hedgerows, couldn't fire through them, and couldn't go around them. The only way forward was through the few gaps or along the sunken lanes that ran between fields. The Germans understood this terrain intimately and had prepared defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire covering every gap and lane. When a Sherman tried to push through a hedgerow, it would nose up as it climbed the earthen berm, exposing its thin belly armor to any German anti-tank weapon with a clear shot. For a few seconds, the tank was completely vulnerable, unable to fire its main gun, which was pointed uselessly at the sky, tracks churning as it struggled over the obstacle. German crews called this the Todeszone, the death zone. They'd position their anti-tank guns to cover hedgerow gaps and simply wait for American tanks to expose themselves. It was target practice. The Bocage fighting in June and July 1944 was some of the bloodiest of the entire war. American armored divisions that had trained for mobile warfare found themselves fighting field by field, suffering casualties that shocked commanders who'd expected to break out of Normandy within days of landing. Tank companies that had landed with 18 Shermans were down to 6 or 8 within a week. Crews that survived one battle knew they'd have to do it all over again at the next hedgerow, and the next, and the next. The psychological toll was devastating. Infantry armor cooperation was supposed to solve the problem. Infantry would scout ahead, spot the anti-tank guns, call in artillery or airstrikes, and then armor would advance once the threats were neutralized. In practice, this rarely worked smoothly. Communications between infantry and armor were difficult. The infantry moved slowly through Bocage country and was vulnerable to German counterattacks. Artillery was often unavailable or inaccurate. Air support was weather dependent and had trouble identifying targets in the dense terrain. Too often, tanks would advance expecting infantry support that hadn't materialized, or infantry would get pinned down, calling for armor support that couldn't reach them. Combat engineers tried various solutions to the hedgerow problem. They used explosives to blow gaps in the hedgerows, but this was time-consuming and alerted the Germans to exactly where the Americans were planning to attack. They tried bulldozer tanks, standard Shermans with dozer blades, but these were in short supply and the dozers couldn't cut through the deep-rooted hedgerows quickly enough under fire. Some units tried using chains and grappling hooks to tear down the vegetation, but the roots defeated these efforts. The army even experimented with specialized hedge-cutting equipment shipped from the United States, but it arrived too late and proved ineffective in combat conditions. Then in mid-July 1944, Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had an idea. Cullen was a tanker who'd been thinking about the hedgerow problem constantly, like every other tanker in Normandy. He noticed that the landing beaches were still littered with German anti-tank obstacles, massive steel structures that the Germans had placed to tear the bottoms out of landing craft. These obstacles, called hedgehogs by the Allies, were made of heavy steel beams welded together in a tripod configuration. Cullen realized that this steel could be repurposed. His idea was elegantly simple. Take sections of German hedgehog steel and weld them to the front of a Sherman, creating steel tusks or prongs that stuck out ahead of the tank. When the Sherman approached a hedgerow, instead of climbing up and over the berm, the steel prongs would dig into the earthen bank at the base. The tank could then drive forward, using its weight and engine power to rip through the hedgerow at ground level. The tank would stay level rather than nosing up, keeping its belly armor protected and its gun able to fire. The crew could cut through a hedgerow in less than a minute rather than spending minutes struggling to climb over it. Cullen fabricated a prototype and tested it. It worked. The Sherman could power through hedgerows that had previously been impassable, emerging into the next field with its gun ready to fire and its vulnerable belly armor protected. Word spread rapidly through the American armored units. This modification actually solved a real tactical problem, unlike the armor modifications that mostly provided psychological comfort. Within days, maintenance units were cutting up German hedgehog obstacles and fabricating Cullen cutters, or rhinoceros teeth, as they came to be called. The speed of adoption was remarkable. Usually, a new piece of equipment would have to go through testing, evaluation, approval, production, and distribution channels that took months. The Cullen cutter went from idea to widespread deployment in less than 3 weeks. By early August, 3 out of 5 Shermans in Normandy had hedgerow cutters welded to them. The modification didn't require rare materials or specialized equipment, just steel scrap and welding capability, both of which were abundant. Maintenance crews could fabricate and install a cutter in a few hours. It was the kind of bottom-up innovation that military organizations usually struggle with, but the desperate circumstances and progressive commanders allowed it to flourish. The impact on operations was immediate and significant. Tanks with Cullen cutters could advance through Bocage country much faster and with far fewer casualties. The Germans could still position anti-tank guns to cover open fields, but the Americans were no longer forced to expose themselves while climbing over hedgerows. Tank infantry coordination improved because armor could move more freely to support infantry attacks. The psychological effect on tank crews was enormous. Finally, here was a modification that actually worked, that gave them a genuine tactical advantage rather than false hope. The installation of a hedgerow cutter became a point of pride for tank crews, visible proof that they'd adapted to the challenges of the Norman terrain. The Army brass, initially skeptical of unauthorized modifications, recognized the value of the Cullen cutter and issued orders to install them as rapidly as possible. General Omar Bradley, commander of 1st Army, pushed hard for widespread adoption. Lieutenant General George Patton, preparing for the breakout operation that would become 3rd Army's race across France, insisted that his tanks be equipped with cutters before they jumped off. The modification that started as one sergeant's improvisation became official Army policy within weeks. But the story of the Cullen cutter raises interesting questions about military innovation and the role of field expedient modifications. Why did it take until mid-July for someone to invent the hedgerow cutter? American forces had been fighting in the Bocage since D-Day, suffering terrible casualties, and thousands of smart, motivated tankers and engineers had been thinking about the problem constantly. The answer is partly that Cullen was in the right place at the right time with the right materials available. But it's also that most formal military innovation processes are slow and risk-averse. Official channels wanted tested, proven solutions. Field modifications were suspect because they hadn't been engineered properly or evaluated scientifically. Kulin's solution worked not because it was sophisticated, but because it was simple. The steel prongs weren't carefully designed to optimal specifications. They were just pieces of German obstacle steel, cut to rough lengths and welded to the tank's front plate. Different maintenance units fabricated slightly different designs. Some used 4 prongs, some used 6, some angled them differently. Nobody knew the correct design because there wasn't one. What mattered was that the basic concept worked and crews adapted it to their specific needs and available materials. This stands in stark contrast to the armor modifications that crews had been making for months. Those modifications were also improvised and field expedient, but they didn't solve the underlying problem. Adding track links to your hull didn't make German 80D guns less dangerous. It just made you feel like you'd done something, which was psychologically valuable but tactically limited. The hedgerow cutter, on the other hand, solved a real tactical problem. It allowed tanks to move through terrain that had previously been nearly impassable without exposing themselves to fire. The difference between modifications that make you feel better and modifications that actually work is the difference between welded track links and Kulin cutters. After the breakout from Normandy in late July and early August 1944, the nature of the fighting changed. American armor was operating in more open terrain where mobility and firepower mattered more than the ability to push through hedgerows. The hedgerow cutters remained installed because there was no reason to remove them, and they didn't hurt performance significantly, but they weren't as critical as they'd been in the Bocage. The armor modifications, however, continued and even intensified as units faced German armor in more frequent engagements during the pursuit across France. By September 1944, the Army Ordnance Department had designed and begun producing an official armor upgrade for Sherman's applique armor plates that could be welded to the hull and turret at depot-level facilities. These plates were engineered to provide actual protection against German anti-tank weapons, properly designed and tested rather than improvised in the field. Tanks could be sent to rear area depots, have the armor plates professionally installed, and return to their units with meaningful protection increases. The official armor packages added about a ton of weight, but provided genuine protection that field expedient modifications couldn't match. Interestingly, many tank crews still preferred their own modifications, even after official armor was available. There was something about doing it themselves, about taking control of their own survival, that mattered to them. Crews that had welded track links to their hull in Normandy kept them even after receiving applique armor plates. It was partly superstition. The modifications had been on their tank when they survived previous battles, so removing them felt like inviting bad luck. But it was also ownership. That tank, with its particular modifications and battle scars, was their tank. They'd adapted it to their needs, and their survival was tied to those adaptations, rational or not. The Sherman's reputation as a death trap, the Ronson nickname, and the psychological trauma of fighting in an undergunned, under-armored tank against superior German armor created lasting controversy after the war. Belton Cooper, an ordnance officer who'd served in Third Army, wrote a memoir called Death Traps that painted a scathing picture of the Sherman as a poorly designed vehicle that unnecessarily killed American tankers. Cooper's account was vivid and emotionally powerful, and it shaped public perception of the Sherman for decades. But Cooper's account was also misleading in important ways. He was an ordnance officer who saw destroyed tanks and wounded tankers constantly, which gave him a biased sample of Sherman performance. He didn't see the thousands of Shermans that fought throughout the war and brought their crews home safely. He didn't understand that casualty rates for American tankers were actually lower than for German tankers, that Sherman crews had better survivability than crews in most other nations' tanks, and that the Sherman's mechanical reliability and ease of maintenance were genuine advantages that saved lives even if they didn't win one-on-one battles with Tigers. Modern analysis of the field expedient armor modifications confirms what the 1944 tests showed. Most of them didn't help much. Welded track links provided minimal protection at significant weight cost. Concrete and sandbags were worse than useless. The modifications that worked were the ones that solved tactical problems rather than simply adding weight. The hedgerow cutter solved the problem of getting through Bocage. The duckbill extended end connectors that were added to tracks to reduce ground pressure and improve mobility in mud solved the problem of tanks getting stuck. These modifications were successful because they addressed actual operational challenges rather than simply trying to add armor in hopes of surviving hits. But understanding that the modifications were mostly ineffective doesn't diminish the courage and initiative of the crews who made them. These men were fighting in tanks they knew were outmatched by German armor, facing weapons they knew could kill them from ranges they couldn't effectively respond to, and they refused to simply accept their fate passively. They took whatever materials they could find and tried to improve their odds of survival, even if the improvements were mostly psychological. That's not stupidity or ignorance. That's human beings refusing to give up, maintaining agency and initiative in circumstances that could easily break their spirits. The story of the field modifications also highlights a fundamental tension in military organizations between standardization and adaptation. The Army wanted standardized equipment that could be maintained and supported through established logistics chains. Every unauthorized modification created potential problems. If a tank threw a track, was it because of combat damage or because the crew had overloaded the suspension with welded scrap metal? If a transmission failed, was it a defect or was it the added weight from armor modifications? Standardization makes logistics and training easier, but it also prevents rapid adaptation to unexpected circumstances. The cooling cutter proved that field expedient modifications could be valuable when they solved real problems and when the command structure was flexible enough to recognize and adopt good ideas, regardless of their source. But the armor modifications prove that field expedient doesn't automatically mean effective, that desperate circumstances can lead to desperate measures that don't actually help, and that soldiers fighting for their lives will try anything even if it's futile. Today, if you visit tank museums and see restored Shermans from World War II, many of them still have hedgerow cutters welded to their hulls. Some have welded track links on their glacis plates. These modifications are preserved as historical artifacts, evidence of how soldiers adapted their equipment to combat conditions. They're testaments to ingenuity and courage, even when that ingenuity didn't always produce the results the soldiers hoped for. The real lesson from the field modifications isn't about armor penetration values or the effectiveness of specific designs. The lesson is about what happens when soldiers are given equipment that they perceive as inadequate for the threats they face. They don't just accept it. They modify, adapt, and improvise. Sometimes their modifications work brilliantly, like the cooling cutter. Sometimes they don't work at all, like concrete armor. But the impulse to try, to take control of their survival rather than passively accepting their fate, is what keeps armies functioning under desperate circumstances. Sherman crews welding scrap metal to their tanks weren't delusional or stupid. They were intelligent men making rational decisions based on incomplete information in life or death circumstances. They saw their friends die in burning tanks. They knew the official channels weren't providing solutions fast enough, so they took matters into their own hands with welding torches and scrap metal and desperate hope. Some of their modifications helped a little, some helped a lot, and some didn't help at all but gave them the psychological strength to climb back into that tank and drive it into combat again, which in its own way was the most important modification of all. The image of tankers frantically welding track links to their Sherman's hull on a summer evening in Normandy, knowing they'll be back in combat the next morning, knowing that German anti-tank guns are waiting for them in the next hedgerow, but refusing to go into that fight without doing everything possible to improve their odds. That's a powerful symbol of human resilience and the refusal to surrender to fate. Whether the track links would actually stop a German 75mm round was almost beside the point. The point was that these men were still fighting, still trying, still adapting, still refusing to accept that they were helpless victims of superior German technology. And that's why the story of the field modifications, successful and unsuccessful, is worth telling and remembering.